Hello everyone and welcome to this morning's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Emily Field, Food Sector Lead here at BSI, and I'll be the moderator today. I will start with a few housekeeping points. This is a listen-only webinar that is being recorded. There is a chat function for discussion and for sharing links. However, please do pop your questions into the Q&A function so we can more easily identify your questions. Simply click on the Q&A button on the side panel and post your questions. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties this morning, please submit any issues again into the Q&A function. My colleagues will be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A functions, and they will be there to help you with any technical issues that may arise. We will be sending a feedback survey following the webinar, so please do fill in and provide us your feedback so we can continue improving these webinars. Once that's completed, you will receive a link to the recording of the webinar. And then just finally to mention that this is a CPD recognised webinar. So I'll kick off with a quick introduction before I hand over to our wonderful line of speakers. Joining us today, we have Elta Smith. Elta is an independent researcher, writer and consultant. She's an experienced leader in making better policies for our food systems. Her research focuses on the intersection of food, the environment and human health. So very well placed to kick off our session this morning. Emma Piercy, Head of Climate Change and Energy Policy at the Food and Drink Federation. Emma has led on developing FDF's work on net zero and its new sustainability strategy, Ambition 2030. Emma works across the farm to fork supply chain and with other industrial sectors to tackle the shared decarbonisation challenges and to align on industry-led solutions. We also have Thomas joining us. Thomas is a fourth generation farmer from South Lincolnshire. Thomas's family farm has 800 hectares where they've been practicing regenerative farming for over 16 years. Thomas has played a key role in the development of the soil carbon market in the UK and across Europe through his role with Agrina. And finally, we have Joanna Trowan, who joins us from ProVeg International as Director of Partnerships and Institutional Engagement, where she leverages her significant research, policy and corporate engagement experience to ensure that ProVeg's activities drive real-world impact. So Joanna is very well placed to discuss with us today the role of food systems and our health. So welcome, speakers. Before we dive into the webinar, a very brief introduction to BSI. So we are the UK's national standards body. We act on behalf of the UK's societal, economic and environmental interest, building trust and assurance for all. We act as the voice of the UK in international standards making within the International Standards Organisation. My role is to work with industry to understand emerging trends, innovations or challenges, and understand where standards can support and better enable the transition towards more sustainable food systems. This webinar is part of BSI's Net Zero Week, which aims to act as a forum for net zero information and knowledge exchange, bringing together subject experts to share insights that could be valuable for your organisation. The focus of today's webinar is to explore how the food system contributes to global net zero goals, but also looking beyond just net zero to understand how we can just transition towards a food system that is positive for both population and planetary health. So before I pass over to our first speaker of the day, just a quick reminder to add any questions you've got into the Q&A function. And with that, I now welcome the floor, Elta Smith. Over to you, Elta.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Good morning, everyone. So firstly, just a big thank you to the BSI for having me here today. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience for coming. Today, we're looking at how sustainable food systems can contribute to achieving net zero. But what exactly do we mean by food systems? I'm here to hopefully set the scene and say a little bit about what food systems are and how they can contribute to sustainability initiatives and in particular to achieving net zero. So I think this definition from the National Food Strategy is a good one. It's simple, firstly, and it refers to two important features of a food system. So the first is all the individual components. So those aspects from farm to fork and beyond that kind of make up that whole system. But not just each individual component, but because food systems are more than just the sum of those parts. Food systems are about how those components interact with and influence each other. So we might consider, for example, that in the UK, we import about half of our food from overseas, including nearly half of our vegetables and most of our fruit. And this global interdependence not only contributes to emissions through transport and other aspects of its production, but also makes our food supply chain vulnerable to climate-related disruptions and geopolitical tensions. We've seen some of those tensions emerge in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, when Russia was obstructing Ukrainian ports, disrupting wheat and maize shipments, which raised global food prices and caused concern about potential staple food shortages. But the challenges, I would say, and opportunities extend well beyond climate change and food security, because our current food systems are really implicated in a range of interconnected issues. And we can look firstly at public health, which we'll hear more about later on in this webinar, where unhealthy diets that are shaped by our modern food environment are contributing to non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease, amongst many other issues. We've got social inequality, and we've seen research by the Food Foundation, which has found that the poorest households in the UK would need to spend as much as 50% of their disposable incomes to afford a healthy diet that aligns with government recommendations. And of course, environmental degradation, which extends well beyond climate change, with the agri-food sector being the primary driver of global biodiversity loss, which of course in turn has knock-on effects on our ability to produce food and sequester carbon. So focusing on food systems, I would say, offers the opportunity not just to reduce emissions, but also to think about how we create a more resilient, equitable, and healthy planet and communities. Next slide, please. So when it comes to net zero, our food systems are both a significant contributor to climate change and also increasingly vulnerable to its effects. So first, let's consider some of the ways in which the impact of food systems on climate change. We know that our food systems contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. They account for up to a third of global emissions. And this includes direct emissions from agricultural practices and also indirect emissions from land use changes like deforestation for agriculture. And within the food systems, agricultural production alone accounts for about 85%, up to 85% of food sector emissions, although the estimates vary quite considerably. And this includes emissions from livestock, fisheries, and crop production. And some greenhouse gases that are particularly prevalent in food production, like methane from livestock and nitrous oxide from fertilizers, have an especially intense effect on climate. So considering that set of issues sort of in the round. Next slide, please. And at the same time, climate change is having a really profound effect on our food systems. We've seen significant evidence in recent years of the effects of rising temperatures, irregular rainfall, extreme weather events that are making harvests unreliable and leading to crop failures in some cases. One example is the heavy rains we've seen in East Anglia in the last couple of years, which have really impacted arable crop production in one of the UK's most important agricultural regions. And over the long term, entire regions could become more unsuitable for staple crops as they become hotter or flooded due to rising sea levels. And these changes can in turn lead to economic instability for major food exporters and drive high prices for importers, which can exacerbate food insecurity. And I would argue that by viewing these issues in a holistic manner, we can better understand the implications of these issues and also the interconnections between the different parts of the system, which can support more effective solutions that are addressing root causes rather than just treating symptoms. Next slide, please. So a systemic approach offers a number of benefits that I think are particularly relevant to net zero ambitions. Here we've got 5 of them. The first is holistic problem solving. So a systems lens gives us the chance to address multiple issues simultaneously. So for example, policies that promote sustainable farming practices can reduce emissions, they can enhance carbon sequestration in soils, and overall resilience to climate impacts. Another example from the National Food Strategy is a proposal to set robust standards for public sector food procurement, which, if done well, could address multiple issues that support British farms, promote local food production, and encourage healthier diets whilst also reducing carbon emissions. We can also identify leverage points. So a systems view helps us to identify key intervention points where changes can have really significant positive impacts. I think food waste is a good example of an increasingly recognized but often overlooked issue in the food system. By some estimates of food waste for a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases globally, and waste is occurring at every stage of the system from farm to fork. So identifying how and where to target addressing the food waste problem in the food system could have a significant positive impact across a range of issues. Thirdly, avoiding unintended consequences. So by considering the whole system, we're better equipped to anticipate and mitigate potential negative climate impacts of our actions in one area of the food system on another. An example could be implementing a multifunctional land use framework, which balances many different land use demands, from agriculture and conservation needs to housing and energy generation, helping to avoid unintended consequences that may occur from siloed land use planning, supporting more effective prioritization, and avoiding overcommitting land to potentially multiple conflicting uses. And then fourthly, promoting cross-sector collaboration. So a systems approach can encourage collaboration between stakeholders and more cross-departmental work in government, which together can help to foster more creative solutions and more integrated approaches, and avoiding conflicts between different policy areas and different parts of the food system for different sectors. And finally, it encourages long-term thinking. This is really important. So encouraging us to consider the long-term impacts of sustainability on our food systems rather than just the short-term gains. Here we could highlight calls for a horticulture strategy to boost domestic fruit and vegetable production, which show how I think long-term thinking about food security, reducing reliance on imports and building resilience against global disruptions. The need, I think, for a food systems approach is in addressing climate change in particular is increasingly being recognized. In 2017, the UN really kickstarted systems thinking for policy development by advocating for its integration in addressing the SDGs. And at COP28 in Dubai last year, there was, you may have remembered, an unprecedented endorsement of a declaration on sustainable agriculture, food systems, and climate action by a record number of countries, which I think signals a growing consensus on the need to prioritize food systems and climate efforts. I think in practice too, a systemic approach to food and climate is beginning to take shape in various contexts. So we can see this really clearly in Scotland's recently passed Good Food Nation Act, which takes a holistic approach to food policy, addressing the health, social, and economic well-being, environmental, and access issues related to affordable food, trying to align different policy areas under a common framework. And I think really demonstrating how a food systems approach can be taken within government. The National Food Strategy is building on previous work, including Food Matters and Food 2030. And the National Food Strategy, published in 2021, offers a very well evidenced and argued blueprint for food system reform. Unfortunately, its recommendations were largely overlooked by the previous government, but it was good to hear, I think, this week from discussions at the Labour Party conference that it may be revived by the new government. But I think there's quite a lot more we can do. And of course, strategies don't have legal standing, so some statutory requirements would be helpful in this context. So, in summary, while our food systems are implicated in many of our current challenges, I would say that adopting a food systems approach can help us to transform not only what and how we eat, but also contributing significantly to our climate objectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alta, for such an insightful keynote and great scene setting for the rest of the webinar. With the food system being both a cause and casualty of climate change, thinking about net zero is integral to the future of our food systems. So with that, I now welcome our next speaker, Emma Piercy, who will talk us through net zero for food systems. Welcome, Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, and indeed, thank you for having me too. And great presentation from Elta, because I think that really sets the scene for what I'm going to talk about here. So a few slides I'll go over quickly, and then we'll focus more on some others. So next slide, please. So I'll touch upon a little bit of what Elta's just talked about, and then some of the activity from Farm to Fork that we've been working on, and then looking at what we as manufacturers in the middle of the supply chain, what we are doing to advance some of those supply chain objectives that we've just been discussing. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so as just discussed, when looking at the emissions footprint of food consumed in the UK, the majority of that is coming from ingredients, and roughly, in terms of emissions footprint, half between that sourced within the UK and that coming from abroad. And then when we look elsewhere along the supply chain, we see that manufacturing itself is just 6%. So let's say from our perspective, the scopes 1 and 2 emissions. So that shows itself the need for us to work with our supply chain partners. And then likewise, also, we discussed the role of consumers, and indeed, actually, when touching upon food waste, for example, 2/3 of food waste actually happens in the home, and 2/3 of which could have been eaten. So there's a lot of action points, both within ingredients and then with consumers, where there's still much more to do. Next slide, please. So back in April, I think it was the end of April, there was an organisation called the Net Zero Council, and we have let's say food has a place at that table, and we did a presentation together. Well, it's Nestle led the presentation, and we facilitated, along with RAP and a couple of others, the slides. And these here are some of the key messages that we put across. So absolutely, in looking at creating an agri-food roadmap for net zero, it's looking right now at where the areas where much more action is needed. Looking at the emissions footprint as well. So I think key messages, around the farming is very much about creating a just transition. So, for example, we have already heard, like, regenerative agriculture is going to be, a key solution tool that will actually help both reduce emissions, but also help out with nature restoration. But there is a sort of transition period for that, and actually, how do we help farmers during those transition periods? It is going to be key thing. I'm sure Thomas is going to talk more about that. But when we look at the value chain, for the food and drink supply chain, farmers and sort of landowners, they manage the land, but only have roughly about 10% of the value chain, which that in itself demonstrates why further along we need to be supporting farmers. So that's about the supply chain, co-creating those solutions. Just moving on to imports. Again, looking at how we procure ingredients from abroad, particularly around sort of the role of deforestation and moving towards zero deforestation. So there's quite a lot of sort of work there, and looking at improving data and supply chain transparency is critical there. And then we've touched upon consumers already and the need to reduce food waste. Before I came to FDF, I came from the energy industry. And of course, as we all know within our homes, energy efficiency is really important and is a way to reduce our bills. And actually, I'd quite like to see a similar mindset when looking at food waste, that we should become much more efficient with how we use food in the home to reduce that wastage. Next slide, please. So what are we doing at FDF on this? Well, last week we had a soft launch, so just the website of our new Ambition 2030. So this is effectively, 5 areas, as you can see here, 5 areas where we are setting an ambition. And I'll cover what those are in a moment. And yes, sort of roadmaps and tools and guidance to help members on that journey. Next slide, please. So in looking at those ambitions, net zero, it's working across the shared supply chain objective ambition of net zero by 2040. And when you're doing sort of the curve towards 2040 and what that means a 50% by 2030. We want to contribute on nature to becoming a nature positive industry. Sustainable commodities, it's about halting commodity-driven deforestation, by 2030. It's about halving food waste by 2030. And on packaging, it's about creating and contributing to that world-class packaging recycling system and reducing the environmental impact of packaging. So within each of these pillars, and so I won't read through the content here, but we then sort of further funnel down as to particular areas, sort of priorities that we will focus on. But clearly, over time, these may shift as needs arise. Next slide, please. So one key, I think, thing to mention is that the strategy recognises that businesses are at different stages of their sustainability journeys. So this is a generalisation, but I'd say, some larger companies, have perhaps more resource and have been able to do more over recent years than maybe others. So we may see them higher up the curve, whereas perhaps SMEs, of which that is predominantly that in terms of looking at companies in food and drink manufacturing, they're predominantly SMEs, maybe lower down the curve. So for each of the pillars, actually, we've been looking at guidance and potential targets and frameworks that companies can sign up to according to where they are starting from on their journey. Next slide, please. So as a couple of examples, I don't give them all in the next couple of slides, but as net zero, for example, we're talking about entry level. It's looking at scopes, setting scopes 1 and 2 targets. In the established part of the maturity curve, it's looking at setting scope 3 and science based. And then on the innovative side, it's actually looking at making own commitments and, of course, the plans to go with it to be net zero by 2040. Next slide, please. So another example around nature. Both nature and sustainable commodities start in the sort of the same place around, establishing footprint and then, sustainable sourcing policies. And then on nature, we're looking at targets to have 50% of fresh food from being sourced from areas with sustainable water management. And then on the innovative side, trialing or piloting those new nature frameworks, for example, TNFD and SBTN, and having potentially regenerative agriculture targets within your procurement policies. Next slide, please. And on food waste, again, similar kind of process, but in the interest of time, I shall move on. Next slide, please. So really, in a sense, to conclude, although we haven't got into all this detail yet, but really the farm to fork supply chain, there are a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different interests. So it's quite fragmented, it's quite complex, and it's very interconnected. The scale of the emissions we've already heard are very high. In fact, when we look at the size of emissions footprint in the UK, it's now more than energy. There is a lot of work that's going on, but we need more collaboration and more policy support. Three areas, I think, sort of key focus areas in terms of bang for the buck, looking at emissions footprint and activity. So on the farming, on consumer use phase emissions, and looking at impact of imports. And it's acknowledging that there are barriers to making further progress, but by working together and understanding what sort of policy tools could help, we will get there. But data is key. Next slide, please, which I think is my last one. And just say that the public launch of our strategy will be at London Zoo on 23rd, and feel free to have a look on our website for more information. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was a great whistle-stop tour into how we should be thinking about net zero in our food systems. Appreciate you kept to time well, and you didn't quite get to the food waste bit, but it'd be great to hopefully touch upon that in the panel discussion. So as Emma mentioned, regenerative farming is often seen as a way to decarbonise the food system and ensure that food production is nature positive and resilient to climate shocks. So with that in mind, it's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Thomas, to talk us through regenerative farming. So before I hand over to Thomas, just a quick reminder to add your questions into the Q&A function. And Thomas, I will now pass over to you. Thanks very much.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I hope I can give some interesting information now about regenerative agriculture. I was asked to talk about regenerative agriculture, and the tricky thing is, as we kind of all know and have, I'm sure, discussed often, it means different things to different people. So I'm going to take this in the context of what we do here on our farm, try and explain what it means to me, and I'm excited for the discussion afterwards to see if hopefully people agree with me. So please, ask as many questions as you can. Just as an introduction, I'm Thomas Gent, as has been said. We farm in South Lincolnshire. We farm just near Peterborough, kind of an hour from Peterborough, if you know the area. We farm about 800 hectares or 2,000 acres, and we've been farming using these principles of kind of regenerative agriculture for 16 years. This is we're actually just going into our 17th year. I'm kind of happy to be able to farm with my family. So my granddad, Tony Gent, he's kind of the first generation that pushed us in this direction to kind of do these practices. Granddad's designs machinery. He holds the patent on some really well-selling no-till drills that are sold all over the world, and he's definitely I would say between me and Grandad, we're the ones that come up with the mad ideas, and Dad's the one that needs to try and figure out how to make them work in reality. So Dad is probably one of the most experienced implementers of regenerative agriculture there is. He's been doing it a long time. He's learned everything he knows from just doing it in the field and making lots of mistakes and learning that way. He now tries to help other farmers to help their transition as well. I'm in a very fortunate position to have both of them with me, really. I'm 27, and obviously I've grown up in this way of farming. So they kind of transitioned our farm when I was kind of about 10 years old. So I don't really know any other way to farm. And I really started looking into this about 5 or 6 years ago, when I kind of realized that what we were doing on our farm was a bit different to what everybody else did, basically, because that was just what we always did. So it seemed very normal to me. But I kind of, came to this realization that we were doing something very interesting. So I set up our kind of farm brand called Gentle Farming to try and, talk more about it, see what opportunities would come up. And, in the last 2 or 3 years, I've seen such an explosion of interest. I I don't know, a farm visit every week at the minute to talk about regenerative agriculture, how it works in practice, how it works in the field, and the different factors that affect it. So that's my family. Obviously, very happy to answer any questions about anything they do and their experience. So just a little bit more about our farm in particular. So yeah, we farm 800 hectares. This is a little bit outdated this slide, but we really focused on making this transition purely 16 years ago for financial reasons. So at that point, 16 years ago, the commodity prices were very poor. Our farm was in a very poor financial position, basically. We're at a stage where we needed to reinvest in bigger, newer machinery. But Grandad had also luckily been to Argentina on holiday and had seen them do no-till farming out there, and wanted to bring that practice back to the UK. So we tried to do kind of a little bit of regen ag on one of our fields in that first year. And luckily for me, I guess, that year, that field yielded actually one of the best yields on the farm. So Dad and Grandad made the leap. They went fully into this way of farming. They definitely probably went, they would say they went into it too fast. We made a big transition quite dramatically into a different way of farming, it was kind of the only way it could be done because there wasn't much knowledge or experience in the market like there is today. But it was tough for us in those first few years. We now grow a big different variety of crops. Part of what we do is try and broaden our rotation to be able to basically increase the diversity on the farm. But really the key to this is we have achieved our goal. We are much more profitable than a conventional farming system than we used to be. And so we kind of achieved the financial goal we wanted to. Luckily, kind of accidentally, the things that we're also doing for pure financial reasons are also the things that are really good for the environment. So we are just using a huge amount less inputs, and that means that obviously we're storing a lot more carbon into the soils. We're also using a lot less insecticides, so we're building a lot more biodiversity on the farm and things like this. I'll go to the next slide. So I just wanted to talk about soil basically. So we can get really nerdy about soil if you want to, and if you don't stop me, I might do. But the really important thing is soils are one of the largest carbon sinks on the planet. Basically everything that anybody eats, all life on Earth, would not exist without good quality soils. And we've essentially spent the last 100 years mining them. And so we need to restore them. We need to put something back. And we need to do that while still producing enough food. Luckily, farmers like us around the world have kind of figured out that there is a way to do that. And there's a huge combination of practices that you implement on farm that allow that to happen. And what we kind of really focus on here is, as it kind of says in that graphic, is minimizing or eliminating soil disturbance, minimizing or eliminating our synthetic inputs, and then maximizing the amount of growing cover I can have on the soil. Bare soil is the most unnatural thing in the world. Like, you will not see bare soil in nature, but like nature does not like bare soil. So when we drive around the countryside and we see any soil basically in any field, that is not natural. So we need to be able to get plants growing on fields 100% of the year effectively. And we know when we do all of this stuff and we manage to restore soil, it has so many of these other benefits, from kind of reducing flood risk, sequestering carbon, building biodiversity, and the really interesting one, growing healthier crops. If you look at kind of the nutrient density of food produced today compared to food produced 100 years ago, they're basically different things. A carrot today is not the same as a carrot 100 years ago. They just don't have the same nutrient density. So our results over kind of the past 15, 16 years kind of speak for themselves. I kind of see the results in two categories. We have the environmental and the financial. Kind of when I speak to food companies, they're often interested in environmental. when I speak to farmers, they're mostly interested in the financial, as you would expect. And yeah, we are kind of approximately 27% reduced our costs compared to a conventional farming system. Very happy to answer questions about that. And then we kind of map our carbon stocks over the years. We see a huge amount more biodiversity, and we do this by implementing all the practices we can do. I could talk about this kind of section for ages about the results we see, but yeah, maybe very happy to answer questions on anything in particular. But we often see this comment that if you do environmental work, it's going to cost loads of money. If you do it right and over time, it can actually be better and more profitable and essentially reduce the cost for everybody. So financial and environmental do and can, I do it, go hand in hand. So that's kind of the end of my slides. Please ask lots of questions. And I just wanted to say I'm always happy to have people on the farm. So if you kind of want to see how these practices work in real life, please come and visit. We've got lots of exciting things going on here. We've got insect farming, robotics, poultry, loads of things. So yeah, I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Such a great presentation. So inspiring to hear the work you're doing on your family farm, and great to hear that Grandad is still coming up with wacky ideas. I think everyone will be kind of surprised to hear that actually the regenerative farming for you guys is more profitable than conventional farming. So look forward to digging into that in a little bit more detail in the Q&A. So from farming to eating, I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, Duranna, who will be sharing insights on the role of healthy diets in the net zero transition. Thanks, Duranna, over to you.
Thanks very much, Emily, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the role of healthy, sustainable diets in helping us meet our climate goals, and including what are some of the kind of really impactful interventions that can help us achieve that dietary shift. Next slide, please. So for those of you that don't know ProVeg and haven't heard of ProVeg before, we're an international NGO with offices in 12 countries across 4 continents, and we're one of the only international NGOs that's dedicated solely to food systems transformation. So we dedicate all of our work to this really, really important topic. We work across 5 key action areas. Those are innovation, corporate and institutional engagement, policy and advocacy, movement building, and public education. So working with a really wide range of stakeholders to achieve food systems transformation. Next slide, please. And Thomas really touched on this in a great way in his presentation just now. Before we kind of really dive into talking about healthy diets, it's important to think about some of the interlinkages when it comes to food systems. And what we are becoming more and more aware of with growing evidence in this space is that climate, nature, and nutrition are inextricably linked. And we refer to this as the climate, nature, nutrition nexus. It basically means that in order to grow food, we need a stable climate and intact ecosystems. That's critical to grow good quality food, but also actually to grow food full stop. And the other side of this is that if we can change what we eat and how that food is produced, we can really start to mitigate climate change, reverse nature loss, and improve public health outcomes. And for me, this is why food is a particularly exciting topic to work on, because it's really the only area where you can simultaneously deliver benefits for climate, nature, and nutrition. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what actually are healthy, sustainable diets? This is a question I get asked a lot. I could give you a complicated answer, or I could give you a more simple answer. I tend to prefer a simpler answer. Here are some examples of kind of different guidelines on healthy, sustainable diets. The one at the top there is the Eat Well Guide, which was referenced by Emma. And this is basically the UK government's national dietary advice. The second one there is the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet, which is being increasingly used as a reference for healthy, sustainable diets. And the one on the right there is ProVeg's Food Plate, which we published recently, which is aimed at helping people understand, should they want to, how to adopt a nutritious, healthy, plant-based diet. So what answer do we really get out of all these different guidelines? Well, we see that healthy, sustainable diets are plant-rich, so they don't have to be exclusively made up of plants, but they should have enough kind of fruits, vegetables, legumes, and pulses in them to deliver all the nutrients we need to live healthy lives. They should be varied, and they should be based largely on whole foods, so minimizing consumption of highly processed foods that are high in fat, salt, and sugar is very, very important. And healthy, sustainable diets, importantly, are made up of foods that people are actually eating. So this is often kind of forgotten when we're talking about healthy, sustainable diets. It's no good to create a dietary pattern that's perfect from an environmental and a health perspective, but no one's actually eating in that way. So we need to kind of encourage people to make small changes so that their diets become healthier and more sustainable, rather than trying to create a huge change which is unmanageable all at once. And we also need to account for variations due to people's personal preferences, culture, where they are in the world, and the traditions they have. That's also very important. And talking about the UK specifically, research shows that actually taking a step toward the Eat Well recommendations will really help us to cut emissions compared to the current average diet. And this is just a slide taking a look at that diet. Really what we see is that our current way of eating in the UK on average is pretty emissions intensive and failing to meet health recommendations. So 4.84 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per capita per day, that's the kind of estimate of the climate impact of our current diets. We see that less than 1% of the UK population is meeting all of the recommendations in our national dietary guidance. And really, if we can facilitate this shift to a healthy plant-rich diet, we see a huge opportunity to cut emissions. So it would get us halfway towards the kind of IPCC target of 2.04 kilograms, and also deliver huge reductions in mortality and diet-related disease. So lots of opportunities to kind of deliver for public health and also on the climate side of things. Next slide, please. And delving a little bit more into the health and climate co-benefits that would come along with adoption of healthy, sustainable diets. What we would really see if we're able to drive a wide-scale adoption of these types of dietary patterns is that we can free up vast amounts of land, we can reduce the emissions associated with food production and consumption and the biodiversity impacts, and this will help us create more room to sequester carbon, to restore nature, but also enable a transition to sustainable agriculture, so some of those practices that Thomas talked about, while keeping our food system within planetary boundaries. And on the right here, you can see some of the recommendations coming out of the National Food Strategy, which Elta mentioned earlier. And we see there that kind of circle on the left. One of the recommendations is to increase consumption of fruit and vegetables by 30%. We know that's really what drives the health benefits. And the biggest health gains come from increasing consumption of fruit and vegetables, closely linked to the increase in fibre. But in order to do that, we also need to reduce consumption of meat. And here in the National Food Strategy, it's looking at a 30% reduction in meat, which is where we get the environmental gains from. So when we're talking about dietary shift, it's really critical that these two things happen in tandem, that we're increasing consumption of fruit and vegetables, also legumes, but that we're also decreasing consumption of animal-sourced foods. And that's how we really get the health, climate, and nature benefits from the diet shift. Next slide, please. So what are some of the kind of big interventions or big levers for change that can help us deliver on dietary shift? The first one is that we need to start seeing more companies and institutions that are involved in food in some way setting targets to rebalance their protein sales. And we're already seeing a lot of action on this agenda in the Netherlands. So you can see on the right there, Lidl and Ahold Delhaize are two of the kind of front runners that have set goals on protein sales that are very closely linked to their delivering on their Scope 3 emission reductions and their climate goals. We're also seeing a large number of the retailers in the UK at least kind of disclosing their protein sales, although they haven't yet set targets to rebalance these. So that's what we would need to see really next, so that companies can start to come up with a plan to deliver on those targets and rebalance their protein sales. And ProVeg do a lot of work on this, particularly in the Netherlands. We're now starting in Germany, where there's a lot of appetite from retailers particularly to work on this topic. And what we're really seeing from our engagements with companies is that when they set these targets, they can really start to understand, well, where are our hotspots when it comes to our protein sales, and what actions and strategies do we therefore need to adopt to rebalance those protein sales and deliver on our climate and health strategies. So, you know, it's a step-by-step process where they collect the data, they set targets, they look at their hotspots, and then they can identify a roadmap and actions to take to achieve that rebalancing. And it also really allows them to understand how their food offer matches up against healthy, sustainable diet models like Eat Well, like Planetary Health Diet. So really, really important, this one. Next slide, please. Another kind of really interesting area is public or institutional catering. So we see examples in some other countries, like Bolivia, for example, where they have a really strong and well-established school feeding program, that institutional catering programs can sustainably increase demand and supply of nutritious foods. So by creating guidelines that focus on whole foods, that are kind of well aligned with national dietary guidelines, this can be an important driver for change. And on the right there, you can see ProVeg's School Plates programme. We're working now with about a third of UK councils to really help them with their school food offer, making sure that there's always a healthy vegetarian option available for children, and also helping them in how to kind of present meals to make them more attractive. And the other important element of public catering is that these contracts are often long contracts, so they can provide a secure market for local producers who are producing healthy foods sustainably. So it can help really drive that supply chain shift from production to consumption. Next slide, please. And the last one I just want to touch on that has real potential to drive a widespread shift to healthy, sustainable diets is marketing and advertising. And we know that this has a really big influence over what people buy and eat. And social marketing is an approach that really helps to change and maintain behaviour for the benefit of the common good. So for example, in this case, obviously we're talking about helping individuals adopt healthier, more sustainable behaviours when it comes to their food choices. And it can also help these food choices be more appealing, be more desirable, be easier for consumers, and be front of mind when they're making their food choices. And these kinds of approaches can also really help address knowledge and skills gaps that consumers have when they're thinking about, well, what should I be buying and how should I be cooking it? So I was lucky to be part of an initiative run by Marks and Spencer in the UK, the Sparking Change campaign, which engaged consumers around doubling their plant protein and eating more fruits and vegetables. And what we really found there is by using simple, positive, clear messaging, we were able to help people shift to healthier, more sustainable behaviours that they were then able to sustain over time. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. So enlightening and so important to discuss the climate, nature, nutrition nexus when we are discussing net zero. So thank you for that. I'd now like to welcome our speakers to turn their cameras on as we begin our panel discussion and Q&A. Thank you all. So Emma, I'd like to pose the first question to you, and then other speakers please do weigh in. Emma, you mentioned on your final slide the size of the prize being significant. And we've certainly heard today how impactful sustainable food systems can be. Yet food doesn't really seem to be getting much attention in the net zero kind of dialogue and narrative. Why do you think that is?
Well, actually, the first thing that comes to mind is data. And there is that phrase, "What you can't manage what you can't measure," something like that. And I think that's part of it. I remember going back a few years, I think back possibly 2021, an HM Treasury report into the costs of meeting net zero. And they did acknowledge, when looking at the breakdown of households' footprint, the role for food. But rather, I don't know if ironically is the right word, but there was then nothing in the whole report around the costs. The analysis has not been done. And I think, the other sort of the challenge is that, well, in again relating to measurement, actually, as we're working out now how to even measure our scope 3, this relates to how complicated the food system is, and and how to measure emissions. But I think there has been progress made, a lot of progress made in measurement. Very far to go and a lot of challenges to still overcome, but we are making progress. And I think the other let's say positive signal is even at the sort of the global level, that I think it was COP27 was the first time that food was actually sort of on the agenda, and then and then last year that there was a pavilion on food, so dovetailing both together, I think we're now starting to get the attention that's needed, albeit long overdue.
Yeah, it does certainly feel as if we're moving in the right direction, for sure. And I mean, a few times the National Food Strategy came up, so I'm kind of keen to touch on that. And perhaps Elta, I can come to you first, and Joanna, you mentioned it as well, so do weigh in there. I mean, the National Food Strategy was developed several years ago. I mean, how optimistic are we feeling now with a new government? And as Elta, you mentioned, kind of some positive takeaways we're hearing from the Labour Party conference. I mean, what are your thoughts on the role of governments in supporting sustainable food systems?
I think government is essential. Governance is the kind of the key piece in the whole puzzle, really. So without effective governance, we really won't have any effective action in this area. There's too much distribution, too much complexity, as Emma mentioned, too many players in the food system, and governance kind of helps to bring all of that together. I think the challenge is how government is going to bring together what have historically been, very siloed departmental and other remits into an effective integrated approach. The Labour government has been pushing for a mission-driven government, and I think that kind of concept provides a really good opportunity to create cross-cutting approaches within government for food systems. It's been very light on actual policy proposals, however, and that's been a little bit disappointing and surprising. A few kind of early wins, I think, hopefully with the watershed on TV advertising for children, for example, and a few other things like potentially putting forward a land use framework. But without that kind of overarching approach, I feel like we're really going to struggle. And I think about, for example, in Wales, where you've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which really provides a kind of fundamental framework for thinking about sustainable development, from which all kind of thinking can proceed. And we don't really have, that doesn't happen in England, and the UK isn't really thinking about sustainable development in a coherent way, and it would be good to see more of that. And I think it really requires some statutory efforts, not just strategies.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So there's lots of questions coming in, Thomas, on regenerative agriculture. But before we kind of go into them, I'm keen to bring consumers into this. There's no kind of denying really that we cannot accelerate positive action without consumers coming on the journey with us. So, John, if I first come to you, what is the most impactful action that consumers can take when it comes to eating more healthy and sustainably?
So there's lots of things that consumers can do on this topic. And I think one of the reasons it's such a compelling topic that everyone has a view on is because food is so personal, right? Everyone's got a view on what they should be eating and why. And I think that's brilliant. And that is actually, that energy is part of what will help us be able to deliver this shift. If you look at really kind of environmental impact assessments on food systems and the role that consumers have to play in helping us shift to healthier, more sustainable diets, the thing that really dictates the impact of food is what type of food that is, as well as how it's produced. Obviously, consumers have less of an influence over food production. That's not something that they can necessarily directly influence themselves. Particularly in the current system where more sustainably produced options are often more expensive. But something that everyone can do is to eat more kind of legumes, more plant-based sources of protein, more fruit and vegetables, and to reduce their meat consumption. And that is also where we see kind of the biggest environmental gains, as well as a really positive outcome for health through increasing consumption of plant-based foods.
Yeah, and a similar question to you, Thomas, around how impactful consumer choice is to the kind of growing movement of regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one because, like, obviously there's a few farmers that are kind of more direct selling, let's say, but most farmers are, right down the bottom of the end of the supply chain, commodity producing, whatever they've got a contract for or whatever they can sell in the commodity markets. So it's really tricky. I would love to grow some other different things if somebody is going to buy them, basically. But it's really hard to do that when, there's so many different people in the stage before it gets to anybody that might actually want to eat it.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that you mentioned at the start of your talk is around regenerative agriculture meaning different things to different people. I mean, how much is that going to be a barrier for adoption?
I think we get caught up on words probably a little bit too much. So, like, everybody likes the term regenerative agriculture. I mean, it sounds good, but like, it means different things to different people. What I really say is, like, it's just intelligent farming. It's just it's just farming. Like, I think what we should really be focusing on more is is farming in the context of your environment. Because what I do here, the practices that I do here, they're going to be irrelevant for somebody in, I don't know, sub-Saharan Africa or or even in Scotland. So it's very kind of context driven, and I don't think we should get too caught up on the specific words we use.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of questions that are coming through now, so I'm going to turn to those now. So, Joanna, first one for you around nutritious diets. So there's two parts to this question. So the first part is around what is holding up why people can't have a nutritious diet. Is it really a cost issue, or availability of healthy food? Or is it about educating people and making healthy products available?
My answer is going to seem like a bit of a cop-out, but it's basically a mixture of all those things. So a big part of it, and we're doing more and more research into this, particularly recently, a big part of it is the food environment. So healthy, sustainable options are often less available, they're less affordable. You know, Elta kind of mentioned that Food Foundation stat that low-income families have to spend a huge portion of their income to afford a healthy diet. It's accessibility. It's also how food is marketed. So we know that only about 2% of food and drink advertising spend goes on fruit and veg. So all these kind of, I guess, more subconscious drivers or structural factors have a huge impact on what people end up buying and eating. And often all those incentives are more in favour of less healthy, less sustainable foods. So that certainly needs to change. And policy is a big part of what needs to happen to make that change. But a lot of this is also about perception. So we did a big multi-country survey recently as part of a multi-partner project, and we identified this kind of group or segment of people who are currently omnivores. They're open to reducing their meat consumption, but they think they need to eat a lot of meat to have a healthy diet. And I'm not talking here about, you know, a couple of burgers a week or something like that. They think they need to be eating a really large amount of meat every day to be healthy. And we know that that doesn't align with the Eat Well Guide, it doesn't align with the Planetary Health Diet. So there is some education needed there on actually, you know, what is the right amount of meat to be eating from a health and environmental perspective. Half your plate should be fruit and veg. You should opt for whole grains. You know, all these kind of healthy, sustainable diet principles that people might not be super familiar with, or just need a bit more guidance in terms of the quantities they should be eating. And I think there's a really great opportunity as well to get children more engaged in food. I think that's where this education piece gets really exciting. Like, yes, we can change the food environment, but actually if people don't grow up with that understanding of where their food comes from, the benefits of adopting a healthy diet, and build those habits of kind of healthy eating and food prep and cooking from an early age, then we've lost that spark and that energy. And just changing the food environment isn't enough. So yeah, slight cop out, but it needs to be a blend of all these things, both the structural factors and the kind of food culture, I guess, needs to change.
Yeah, complex, difficult, certainly. So the second part to that question is around what are the major food companies' response to this, knowing this is crucial to addressing people's healthy diet. So I don't know if you want to expand on that, thinking specifically around major food companies and what they're doing at the moment to address this issue.
Yes, happy to. So I've been working with a variety of companies on this topic for a while now. When I first started, no one wanted to hear it. It was hard work. It was a lot of, you know, saying stuff, getting ignored, saying it again in a slightly different way. But actually things have changed a lot, I would say, particularly in the last 5 years. And there's now a lot more of a desire for actually collective action on this topic. So we're seeing some of the large multinational companies, I referenced Lidl and Ahold Delhaize, to you know, large retailers who are taking this issue really seriously. They've both set targets to rebalance their protein sales by 2030. And they're now looking at, well, what are the strategies that can help us get there? Co-op in the UK, I think probably about, 3 or 4 years ago now, brought in price parity, so made the price of their own brand meat alternatives no more than meat. which we know is an important factor to help people make a small swap in what they buy and eat. And yeah, I get a lot more requests for support on this topic now from a whole range of companies, from food service, manufacturers to retailers. And what they're saying is, we want to do more, but actually often the lack of an enabling policy framework is holding us back. So obviously companies can't do things that won't work for them from a business perspective. So yeah, I think we're in a place now where we're really starting to see more industry ambition, but it's being held back by the lack of that enabling policy framework.
To kind of similar to this conversation around healthy diets, a question has come in, I think probably both for Thomas and Joanna, around kind of a core aspect of regenerative farming, being the integration of livestock within the farming system. Is that at odds with the goal to reducing animal protein intake as part of a healthy diet? I'm seeing lots of shakes, so I welcome Thomas. Go for it.
Yeah, so like from a farming perspective, I need not more livestock. I need livestock in the right places, let's say. So I need the livestock to be out of the shed where it's not doing anything good for my soil, and in the field where it is doing good for my soil. There's a lot of practicalities around that make it difficult, and pricing is the trickiest one of them probably. But from a farming perspective, to be honest, I wouldn't be able to farm how I farm with the lower costs without using a large amount of animal manure.
Joanna.
And perhaps, as I was going to say, I would add on to that by saying, the sustainable practices that our UK farming is doing, are fantastic, and if it would be really great to be able to therefore sort of reduce also some of the imports perhaps from places with lower environmental standards, and eat more from our British farmers. Equally, you could almost phrase it like competitive sustainability, and actually that could be something that with our farming we could even look to export and displace elsewhere where it's done better here. So I think that's a key point. And the other thing to not so much add into the mix, but it's just a little reminder that actually, our populations are not static. Over the next, I think I read earlier, by 2050, UK's population will be up by 10%. Globally, it will be up by nearly 25%. We're going to be having some big pressures here. So that's where actually looking at the whole food system, where not only domestically but where we're getting from is going to be really important.
And maybe just to add quickly on this, because I think this is always a good discussion, isn't it, with this question? But I don't think it's at odds. We need to reduce the amount of meat we're eating, but with a particular focus on the meat that's produced that has a high environmental impact, right? And we know that there is a big difference in environmental impact depending on how different types of meat are produced. So what we really need to see is a shift to kind of less meat, but better quality meat. And I would encourage people to have a look at the Eating Better Alliance in the UK, because they do great work on this issue. But I think that's the key, really. It needs to be less, it also needs to be better. And we need to look at examples like Thomas's, where we can really see what that looks like at a farm level, and how livestock can be incorporated on the farm in a way that's sustainable and that contribute to nutritious diets. What I would say is that I think part of the challenge at the moment is that we often measure food system progress from an environmental perspective in terms of climate emissions per kilogram of food. And that's not always necessarily the most helpful metric when it comes to thinking about better quality livestock and meat products. So I think there's a bit of a shift needed in terms of what are the other metrics we need, like looking at farm practices and more sustainable farm practices, to make sure we're making that shift to less and better in a way that works for public health and also for the environment.
Yeah. Emma, you actually mentioned in your slides that there might be an initiative with some of your members perhaps around regenerative agriculture being part of procurement policies, which kind of builds on Joanna's comment there. Is that something you're seeing more and more of then?
Well, we have a number of our member companies which are working with suppliers, with farmers directly to support them with building in the regenerative practices. So off the top of my head, McCain's, most of the audience will have seen adverts on TV talking about that. Unilever, Nestle, they've all got programs, and there are others too. But I think, Thomas mentioned a really key point around, well, what is regenerative farming? And, it is different. It's different for different crops. It's different for different topographies. And actually, a gentleman from the NFU said to me, he doesn't like the phrase regenerative farming too much. He said to me, farming based on regenerative principles. And actually, I thought that was a really good way of putting it. So for public consumption regenerative farming, but actually really what we mean is looking at how we're farming and tailoring it to the crops and to the area. But because of all those differences, it also means that that's difficult for our members, for our manufacturers, about, well, how to engage and support. So this is a very sort of new area. There was a lot of, let's say, trialing going on. So even within our maturity curve approach that I talked about, that's why, that sort of the setting targets around regenerative farming and having that as a percentage of your ingredient sourcing is more on the innovative side, because actually there's quite a bit of work to get to that point. And I think a key thing for FDF's activity in this area is exploring what support do manufacturers need in order to be able to give that helping hand to farmers, to enable them, to help them with that transition. And so that's, I think, in terms of the policy, enabling policy framework, that's something we all need to be working on together as to what would work for farmers, how can we support that, so that you've got a win-win.
Absolutely. Elta, I wonder if you want to come in there with your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder, we've talked a little bit about standards, and I'd be very interested to hear what Thomas thinks about this, because, we talk about regenerative agriculture as practices. We don't want to get too caught up in the language, and yet there's a big push towards, what is described as regenerative agriculture amongst many players in the food system, and yet there's a kind of lack of clarity and consistency around how we define what it is, and a question about whether and to what extent we want to do so. I'd be curious to hear from the BSI as well in terms of the work they've been doing, and where standards could potentially play a role in helping to create more kind of coherence around how we're thinking about these kinds of practices in our food systems, and also to kind of link up the different players in the supply chain when they're trying to understand like what they're procuring and what they're selling.
Yeah,
feels like
absolutely.
a great opportunity, I guess. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, yeah, you mentioned out of the work BSI doing on looking at what is needed to help scale regenerative farming, and you're right in saying that we are researching at the moment if we can support that movement through standardization solution, and Thomas has been integral to that research, which continues. Thomas, I'm going to pass the mic to you. There's a few questions coming up. I'll give you a chance to respond to Elta, but also just to pose a question to you that's come from the audience as well to think about, which is your comment about profit, really, and a curiosity around actually how you've been able to increase profit versus that conventional farming. But I'll stop there. But there is a second part to that question as well.
Okay. Yeah, so just to reply on to the standards thing. So, I completely understand. So I have two schools of thought on this, and I'm not really sure what the right answer is. We definitely need a standard, because otherwise nobody's going to be able to reward it, because they're not going to be able to put it, a corporate is not going to be able to put it on their annual report or whatever, or product, or So I kind of understand that. The bit that I'm super nervous of is, in my experience, standards always stifle innovation on farm, because what it encourages is, me to just meet the minimum possible standard, no, the minimum criteria to get that sticker on my product, and all is good. And that's kind of not what we want, right? We want people to keep pushing the end boundaries of moving it forward. And that's my concern, and my question really is, can you build a standard that doesn't just encourage me to meet the minimum criteria to be able to get the sticker on the box? Farmers, we need to keep pushing forward. Like, we've been doing it for 16 years. There's still loads of things that I'm not doing very well, and I could be doing better. And like, there's I want to get to the next stage of regen ag, which I think there's a lot more we could do. So that's my comment on that. And then on profitability, the simple answer is it takes time. That's the first thing. So essentially, I'm more profitable for two reasons. The main one is reduced capital expenditure. So I just have a lot less tractors, in simple terms, than a conventional farm. And especially today, tractors are going to cost you a lot of money. So probably over the whole business, you save in £500,000 on sort of tractor capital that is not stored, that's not stuck in that machinery that depreciates. And then the second one is reduced input. So reduced chemical applications and reduced fertilizer applications. Essentially, the way I can do that is I'm relying on the biology to give me all of that stuff for free, instead of buying it in a can. So the only thing is, it doesn't, that's not an instant thing. That takes, we're 15 years in and we're still trying to get further and further down that. It's much more of a gradual change. And to be honest, I think we could go a lot further than where we are. It's just about testing the boundaries and understanding what is possible, basically.
Thanks, Thomas. And the kind of second part to that, which maybe kind of feeds into the standardization solutions discussion as well, which is around if it kind of commercially makes sense and ecologically makes sense, why aren't more farmers practicing regenerative practices?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's two reasons a farm, you can sort of say three. Let's say there's three reasons farmers are not changing. The first one is financial. So in the longer term, absolutely, we can prove it is good. But in the shorter term, it can be more expensive. So during your first, 3-4 years of transition, essentially the simple reason why it takes a while is because biology doesn't just instantly appear in your soil. Biology takes 3-4, depends on the years, but that kind of time period to be able to grow and develop and do that work for you. So in those years, you can have big issues and crop losses and things like that. So that's kind of a risk that farmers have. The second one is knowledge. So this is quite a new sector. There's not there's a lot of advice available to farmers about how to farm conventionally. That's what all farmers learn at school, and that's kind of what everybody knows. But to be able to farm in this way requires a completely different set of skills and knowledge and education, basically. So there's a lot more of that available. And to be honest, if a farmer wants to, they can find it, but it's less readily and easily available. And then the third one is a little bit less tangible, but it's more the community feel, basically. So often regenerative farmers are seen as those kind of hippie weirdos in the farming community. So, and that has a bit of a kind of community perception around it. And that comes in different guises, in different communities, and different formats. But that kind of it's kind of less tangible and harder to describe. But that kind of community relationship is maybe one of the trickiest in some situations. And even just quickly, even family relationships. So like, maybe the granddad doesn't want it to be done like that, but the son does, and there's a lot of tension and that kind of thing. So they're the three things that I see when I speak to farmers that make a difference.
I don't know if I could just quickly jump in. I thought it was some interesting points. The last one, all interesting, Thomas, but the last one you made, around the adoption of that and let's say culture and that kind of thing. I went to Groundswell for the first time this year, and I was like amazed at the vibe of the place. I always kind of describe it as the Glastonbury of farming, but it was infectious, the enthusiasm, but also understanding how big the event has grown. It's 8 years since it started, and now there are 8,000 people there. So I think there is a momentum that this is building, but it's kind of, let's say, moving towards trying to make it more mainstream, and maybe it is the younger generations that are going to use and helping maybe to bring it back. And I think it will happen. I think there's a lot of positive energy around this. And I think the other interesting thing at Groundswell is actually the amount of supply chain people that were there, also interested in learning to try and help support. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, 100%. I remember Groundswell, 5, 6 years ago, was like not many people there, but nowadays everybody wants to ticket and it sells out instantly. But that's definitely the most interesting point. So there's loads of farming events in the country. Groundswell's the only one where you see non-farmers there, if that makes sense. The people that are interested in buying from farmers, which is, they're my customers, right? Like, if they're not there, then why should I be there, really, kind of thing. So, it's definitely moving. I would say we're kind of like, the classic bell curve. We're kind of starting to go up the steep bit. But when we get to that steep bit, that's when the tough farmers, they take a bit of convincing. But I think the momentum is in the right direction.
I'm going to quickly run through a few other questions because there's lots coming through, really interesting ones. Joanna, one for you here around how we can balance the environmental issues with alternative proteins, but there's a comment around actually avoiding ultra-processed foods, which I know has actually come out quite a lot recently. So really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, happy to. Contentious topic, this one. Topic. But so ultra-processed foods, I think part of the issue is that the media and kind of the public discourse has really grabbed onto this. And like with many other things, the way the media works is to tell a really strong story, right? Which often reduces some of the nuance that comes with the scientific evidence and the research into different topics. And I think that's really what we've seen with ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods, I think everyone knows that there are foods that you shouldn't eat a great deal of, that you can enjoy in moderation as treats, things like crisps, biscuits, cakes. We all pretty much know that it's not healthy for us to eat loads and loads of those foods, right? Because they're high in calories, they don't have a great deal of the macro and micronutrients we need for healthy, nutritious diets, and they're often, very high in unhealthy fats, salt, and sugars. What we have seen is that a whole group of foods have been kind of lumped into that category, rather than the category being sort of split out and assessed according to nutrient value rather than processing. And we know that processing is not necessarily an unhealthy thing, right? We've had processing for hundreds and hundreds of years. Wholemeal bread is a processed food, and lots of other things that are actually can be part of a healthy diet, basically, and are often also more affordable, accessible options for people. And we've seen that happen quite a lot with plant-based alternatives to meat and milk. I'm not saying that all of these products are healthy and nutritious, and certainly, as was in my presentation, we should really be focusing on helping people follow diets that are largely based on whole foods. But these products can be an important bridge to help people that actually don't want to make huge changes to their diet, but they want to make a simple swap that's better kind of for the environment. And that's where these products come in. And actually, we're about to release an analysis next month that delves a lot more into the nutritional value of these products and compares them to their kind of animal-based alternatives. Because the other issue we've seen is that often plant-based alternatives are being compared to a chickpea or a steak, and they're not intended to replace those products, right? They're intended to replace more processed meat products like sausages, like bacon, like burgers. So we need to make a fair comparison to really understand, well, what are the implications of someone switching an animal burger for a plant-based one? So more on that to come from ProVeg. Our analysis includes the UK, but also lots of other countries. And we went into supermarkets to have a look at the products available and their nutritional value. I'm very happy to share that kind of when the results are published. But yeah, just to say really that these products are not always less healthy than the animal-based versions. So it's about helping people understand, well, what are the choices you can make? What are the small switches you can make that are beneficial, and helping consumers navigate and understand how to choose better quality products. I hope that answers it more or less.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like you guys have carried out some really important research work there. So look forward to seeing that when that does come out. There's a question on food waste, which I'm keen to get to, Emma. But first, I also just want to bring up water because we haven't yet spoken about water. So Thomas, probably one for you, but obviously please anyone do weigh in. There's a question here around the co-benefits of regenerative agriculture regarding the water cycle in terms of water security.
So in simple terms, soil solves the water problem. To be honest, if you have healthy soils, it does both things really well. So in a time of drought, it stores a huge amount of water. So a couple of years ago, I can't remember, I think it was COVID summer, it was super hot. Obviously all the crops were kind of suffering due to not enough rainfall. You could have driven around our area and seen which fields were our fields because the plants were still growing, they were still green, because that soil has managed to hold on to that, basically increase its water holding capacity. So that's amazing. But amazingly, it also does the opposite. So in times of flood, this winter was last winter was kind of a super good example. It was extremely wet, but our fields didn't really flood. We still managed to drive on them earliest in the year when we needed to, and we were kind of the latest on the fields in the autumn, just because the soil basically acts like a sponge and absorbs it. When you have really good soil and you drive over it with a tractor, you can literally see the soil sponge down under the weight of the tire, but then spring back up. And that's all those air pockets in the soil, and the water can sit in there, and that's kind of what it's built for, effectively. And then the third really important one is reduced runoff. So one of the biggest problems we have is literally our soil is just running away into the sea. You can kind of see these satellite maps where you kind of see soil pouring off the land into the ocean, which is crazy because that's the thing that keeps us all alive. But if you have really good soil structure and really healthy soils, it basically sticks together, and there is really no runoff. Like the water that comes off our fields is kind of, you could drink it, kind of crystal clear. The simple answer is soil always solves all problems, whatever they are. That's my answer.
The headline of this session: soil is the answer. Thank you so much, Thomas. And food waste, Emma, coming to you. I'm conscious that this is probably one of few conversations with net zero and food in the title that hasn't yet spoken about food waste. So keen to hear from you in a
So I think the statistics are around, like a third of food produced is wasted. Globally, that accounts for 9 to 10% of emissions. So it's huge. And then, it's quite interesting that when we've talked about consumer behaviour and dietary shifts, that's why when I touched upon in my presentation, also the role of addressing food waste in the home, because 2/3 of food waste is actually in the home. So there is certainly, when we look at our maturity curve in this sort of the innovative space, we now also, want to look at, well, how can we as manufacturers help consumers in the home to reduce food waste? So that's one element. But I think more broadly, then looking at how we can help elsewhere, or other reducing food waste, increasing the redistribution of surplus, and of course reducing waste in the process itself, and also helping farmers distribute, where there is, I don't know if you describe it as surplus stock, but some of that, whether there's, well, but Thomas would be best to articulate that, but it's looking at where each point of the supply chain, what can we do to reduce it, and playing our role within that.
And you touch exactly on one of the questions that we've been asked here around 2/3 of the food waste is created in the home. The question we've got here is has there been exploration into the accessibility of adequate cooking and storage at a consumer level? For example, many people only have access to tiny one-shelf freezers, particularly in built-up environments like cities. So how can we make kind of cheaper, more sustainable bulk cooking more accessible, I suppose?
I mean, it's a good question. I certainly know from, let's say, community kitchens that I think it was, I'm probably going to get the name wrong, the King's Fund, or I know that they put a lot of investment around freezers, for example, to be able to help take on the surplus food that was near to use by, but also that probably helps address some of the cooking there. But I think, I can't imagine that we're probably looking at increasing freezer space in people's homes. So we're going to have to think up some innovative ways of being able, to address this, but certainly actually being innovative in the home as well, and looking at what is in our fridges and how can we use that. I mean, it's something I think we can all do a lot more often, me included.
And that brings us back to your kind of comment in your presentation around food efficiency and applying kind of that thoughts on energy efficiency to food. We are 1 minute over, so that does bring us to the end of this morning's webinar on food systems. Thank you so much to our speakers and panelists for joining us this morning. Thank you to the audience for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. Enjoy your days and look out for that feedback survey when it comes through. Thank you all so very much.